Regents Prep lesson number 2. Our aim today is how did literature deeply influence the development of the United States? And when we talk about the concept of literature, I think I'm using the term kind of loosely, but we're talking about really any written works in the United States that have been extremely influential, and there have been plenty of them. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Important literature in American history. The first piece of important literature in American history was Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine. This was before the Declaration of Independence, and what Thomas Paine was trying to, convince the people of the colonies to do was to declare their independence from Britain. And they were pushing to, he was pushing them to join this movement to declare independence because of the way that they were being treated by the British. Remember, during the colonial period, the British are taxing them very heavily, not giving them any say in Congress, right? In Parliament, taxation without a representation. And Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, and I think the name says it all. Common sense. It is common sense that we, um, you know, uh, separate from Britain because of what they are doing to us. And he really got a lot of people on board with the independence movement. And remember that at this time, late 1700s, uh, literature or print is really the only way that people can get their point across um, to a large audience. The second piece of literature we're going to talk about is the Declaration of Independence itself, which is an incredibly important piece of written work in American history. It came from the philosophies of the Enlightenment, most notably John Locke, life, liberty, and property, John Locke said, and in the Declaration of Independence it is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They were listing their grievances against the King of Britain, all the things he had done wrong, all and why they didn't want to be part of the British Empire anymore. And they were declaring that the colonies were no longer under British rule. And really, July 4th, 1776, the day is the Declaration of Independence is completed, is the day the United States becomes its own country. They are breaking away from Britain. All right. Soon after, when the United States is in its early years and trying to find a government that works for it, all right, if you recall, the Articles of Confederation is their first government. It's very weak and it fails. But after that, you have the Constitution. And there were many people who liked the Constitution. However, there were others that disliked the Constitution. And the Federalists were a group of people who liked the Constitution. They liked the idea of a strong federal government, right? And their opposition was the Anti-Federalists, the people that did not want a strong federal government because they were afraid a strong federal government would take away their powers. However, the Federalists really pushed for this new Constitution, and the Federalist Papers were written by a bunch of Federalists, among them Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, and they were pushing for ratification or approval of the Constitution, and they were promoting the idea of more federal power. They wanted the United States to be kind of bound together by a strong central or federal government. If we move on to the Civil War period or the pre-Civil War period, one of the things that really pushed the Northern dislike for slavery was the book Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And this book was very important because it exposed the horrors of slavery. And after this, Northerners really, to an even higher degree, disliked slavery and the concept of slavery. And, this kind of exposes the way in which these African Americans in the South, these slaves, are being treated. In 1848, the women meet for the first time to kind of discuss the idea of women's rights and the right to vote and the concept of equality. And it's not just women that meet that day; there are also men that are for the cause. And they write what's called the Declaration of Sentiments, which is kind of an extension to the Declaration of Independence. And basically, women are saying, you know, you said all men are created equal. Well, what about all men and women are created equal? Shouldn't it be that? And the women met at Seneca Falls, and they said they deserved the same rights as men. and this is really planting the seed for the women's movement. 1848, and women get the right to vote in 1920. So a full 72 years later, women finally received the right to vote. Probably the most important point in history for literature was the Progressive Era. And the Progressive Era was, if you guys recall, a time period when there was a lot of ills in society. Probably most of them were caused by, the urbanization and industrialization of America. And one of the best ways to expose these wrongs in society, these muckrakers, these people that dug up the muck, they were, these muckrakers wrote books and short stories exposing the ills of society. And you have Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle. He exposed the ills in the meatpacking industry. He led to the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. The History of Standard Oil by Ida Tarbell exposed a monopoly in the oil industry. All right, Rockefeller, who put her father out of business. Her father was an oil person, and Rockefeller put him out of business with his dirty business tactics. And How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Riis, which you guys read this year, exposed the disgusting tenement conditions in New York City of immigrants. A little later on, you have a movement, uh, women's empowerment and women's rights, and the feminine mystique by Betty Friedan really moves that forward and encourages social reform, more rights for women. And finally, Letters from the Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King Jr. This is basically his reflections while in a Birmingham jail, and he discusses the ideas of civil disobedience, civil equality, the concept of integration, and what he really wanted in the United States and what he really expected to accomplish, um, and what he planned to see for the future. There's some talking points to keep in mind for tomorrow, and I would also like you to bring in your own, please. Which piece of literature do you believe is most important to the development of America? Explain. Why was literature such an important catalyst or factor for change in American history? Explain using examples. And do you believe literature is still powerful? What mediums do you think are most powerful today? Explain. And when I say what mediums do you think are most powerful, I'm talking what is the way in which most people get their point across, spread ideas, spread values, or whatnot. We have three check for understandings today. The first check for understanding is the impact of works by such authors as Harriet Beecher Stowe, Upton Sinclair, and Ralph Nader suggest that A. Reform literature is not popular with the public. B. Aroused citizens can persuade the government to take action. C. Big business is too powerful to be affected by reform literature. Or D. Popular literature tends to reflect the views of the political party in power. Even though you don't know who Ralph Nader is, just because you know who Harriet Beecher Stowe is and Upton Sinclair is, you should be able to figure this one out. The second check for understanding. The Federalist Papers were published in 1787 and 1788 to help gain support for A. Bill of Rights, B. The ratification of the Constitution, C. A weaker central government, or D. The abolition of slavery and the slave trade. And finally, there's a quote from Thomas Paine. Everything that is right or reasonable pleads for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries. 'Tis time to part. In this quotation, Thomas Paine is trying to convince the colonists to A. Accept the proclamation of 1763, B. Break a treaty with Spain, C. Declare their independence from England, or D. Dissolve their alliance with France. And we will discuss these tomorrow in class. Have a good night.